The introverted intuitive has, in a way, a very difficult life, although one of the most interesting lives.
Have you ever been told you're too quiet, too distant, too serious? If you are an introvert, you have been in a situation where you remained quiet in a room full of people, and they had already made up their minds about you. You know better, because you don't want to spend your energy on pointless, surface-level conversations. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from fear. It comes from depth, from awareness, from knowing that not every thought needs to be spoken. But in today's world, that silence gets mistaken for something else. People call it coldness. They say you're hard to read. They assume you think you're arrogant, when the truth is you're just tired of shallow conversation. You don't talk just to fill space. You don't need to perform to prove you're paying attention. You observe, you reflect, you listen. But in a society addicted to noise, those things aren't seen as strengths. They're seen as threats. Carl Jung was one of the first modern psychologists to describe what we now call introversion, not as shyness, not as insecurity, but as a fundamental orientation of the mind, one that turns inward, seeking meaning from within, not from external validation. Jung believed that introverts aren't just people who like to be alone. They're people whose energy moves toward the depths, toward understanding, pattern, insight. And because of that, they often don't match the tempo of the world around them. And that's where the problem begins. Because society doesn't make space for silence. It doesn't pause for reflection. It doesn't reward internal clarity. It rewards charisma. It rewards performance. It rewards those who can speak the fastest and shine the brightest, even when they have nothing to say. So where does that leave someone like you? Someone who thinks before they speak. Someone who feels overwhelmed by crowds and drained by surface-level chatter. Someone who doesn't want attention, but still wants to be understood. The answer is simple. You're misread, misjudged, pushed to the edges. But here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Society doesn't just misunderstand introverts. It resents them because your silence, it makes people uncomfortable. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're not giving them the response they expect. You're not validating their persona. You're not playing the social game. And in a world built on reaction, your quiet becomes rebellion. Your stillness becomes power. Your refusal to entertain becomes a mirror. And mirrors, real ones, make people uneasy. So what happens when the world is built for extroverts? But your nature was never meant to compete with noise.
One of the most difficult types is the intuitive introvert. The introvert, why? Is more difficult because he has intuitions as to the subjective factor, namely the inner world. And of course that is now very difficult to understand, because what he sees are most uncommon things. He doesn't like to talk of them. If he's not a fool, because people won't understand it.
Carl Jung didn't see introverts as socially awkward or broken. He saw them as psychologically inverted, not lesser, just facing a different direction. While the extrovert gathers energy from the outer world, people, stimulation, recognition, the introvert draws it from within, from thought, from solitude, from stillness. In Jung's words, introverts are oriented toward the subjective. They process the world through meaning rather than momentum, through reflection rather than reaction. This is not a weakness, it's not a flaw, it's a completely valid and necessary psychological posture. But society doesn't see it that way, because we live in a world that worships visibility. We value the speaker, not the thinker. The loud voice in the room, not the one who listens. The entertainer, not the observer. So from a young age, introverts learn to shape-shift, to put on what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear to fit in, to smile even when we're exhausted, to make small talk when silence would have said more, to pretend we're fine when we're actually drowning in noise. The persona becomes a shield. But over time, it also becomes a prison, because the more you perform extroversion, the more you disconnect from your actual self. You forget that your quiet isn't a problem. You forget that not wanting to be in the spotlight doesn't mean you're hiding. You forget that needing space doesn't make you selfish. And in forgetting, you begin to betray yourself. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in subtle, daily acts of abandonment. Saying yes when you mean no. Laughing to be polite. Nodding when you disagree. Showing up when what you really needed was rest. And every time you do that, a part of you retreats a little further. Not because you're weak, but because you've learned that being authentic comes with consequences. It makes people uncomfortable. It invites questions you don't want to answer. It makes you different. And different, in most environments, is dangerous. But here's what Jung understood better than most. The journey toward becoming yourself, the real you, the deep you, always starts with rejection. Not just from others, but from the version of you that tried so hard to fit in. Because you can't become who you really are, while still apologizing for being quiet. You can't claim your depth, while still trying to survive on the surface. And yet, the moment you stop pretending, the moment you choose truth over performance, you'll feel it. Not applause, not approval, but resistance. People will pull away. They'll question your sudden shift. They'll say you've changed, but you haven't changed. You've just stopped acting. So the question becomes, are you willing to be misunderstood in order to be real? Or will you keep performing just to be accepted by a world that was never built for you in the first place? Introverts often hear the same feedback over and over. You're so quiet. You don't talk much. Why do you always look so serious? What they don't realize is this. You don't make them uncomfortable because of something you said. You make them uncomfortable because of what you didn't. In the absence of noise, people project. In the presence of stillness, they start to see themselves. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He called it projection, the unconscious act of placing our own insecurities, fears, and judgments onto someone else. And introverts, they become the perfect screen. Because when you say less, people fill in the blanks. When you observe instead of entertain, they wonder what you're thinking. When you don't react, they feel exposed. Your silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors reveal more than most people want to see. That's why your quiet presence can change the energy of a room without saying a word. Not because you're trying to make a statement, but because you're not feeding the noise. You're not validating egos. You're not playing the social games. You're not echoing the surface-level chaos that most people depend on to feel real. And that is terrifying to them. Because your calm highlights their restlessness. Your depth exposes their distraction. Your solitude confronts their need to be constantly seen. In a world addicted to instant reaction, your non-reaction is revolutionary. It interrupts the loop. It makes people pause. It makes them feel something, and they can't even explain why. So they call you names. They say you're cold, arrogant, distant. They accuse you of thinking you're better than them, when all you're doing is not performing. But their discomfort says more about them than it does about you. They're not reacting to you. They're reacting to the reflection you unintentionally hold up. Because being around someone who doesn't seek approval forces others to confront how much they rely on it. And the ones who depend on the spotlight can't stand the person who's comfortable in the shadows. You don't provoke people with your voice. You provoke them with your presence. You don't need to defend yourself. Your stillness is enough. But here's the hard truth. Being a mirror comes at a cost. Because once people realize you won't play the part they imagined for you, they'll start to push you out. Not always loudly, not always directly, but you'll feel it. The shift, the withdrawal, the subtle rejection, not because you did anything wrong, but because your quiet binds them of the noise they can't live without. So the question is, will you shrink your presence just to protect their illusion? Or will you hold the mirror steady, even if it makes people walk away? From the moment you step into school, you're graded on more than your answers. You're graded on your volume, your enthusiasm, your ability to raise your hand quickly, speak confidently, and participate constantly. Not how deeply you think, not how well you listen, not how clearly you see through the noise. This is where the bias begins. Early, subtle, and persistent. The louder child is praised as a leader. The quieter one, asked to come out of their shell. But what if the shell isn't a prison? What if it's a sanctuary? Carl Jung warned about the persona, the social mask we create to function in a world that doesn't understand our core self. For introverts, that mask often starts in the classroom. You learn to smile when you're exhausted, to speak up when you have nothing to say, to pretend comfort in environments that drain you. You start performing extroversion, not to connect, but to survive. And that performance doesn't stop in adulthood. In the workplace, the confident speaker is assumed to be competent. The talkative manager is seen as a natural leader. The one who networks endlessly gets promoted. Meanwhile, the quiet thinker is ignored. The observer is seen as disengaged. The introvert who doesn't sell themselves is left behind. Not because they lack ability, but because they don't perform visibility. We've built a world that mistakes presence for substance and certainty for wisdom. And in that world, introverts are rarely noticed until they're gone. But this isn't just about misunderstanding. It's about a system designed to reward noise over depth. We live in an age where speaking first is valued more than speaking truth, where appearing confident matters more than being right, where being charismatic counts more than being sincere. The bias toward loudness isn't just social, it's structural. Extroversion has been wired into our definitions of success. And here's the irony. Most of the world's quietest minds have shaped its loudest changes. Philosophers, scientists, artists, revolutionaries. Not with volume, but with vision. They didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. They just needed the courage to speak when it mattered. But today, the quiet ones are told to speak more, to market themselves, to build a personal brand. The message is clear. If you're not visible, you don't exist. And so the introvert is forced to make a choice. Adapt or disappear. Perform or be overlooked. Pretend or be misunderstood. But what if the real power isn't in being loud at all? What if the greatest strength is in not needing to be seen to know your worth? What if presence can speak louder than performance, if you learn how to hold it? Because in the end, the world may be built for extroverts, but the people who change it, they rarely speak the loudest. In today's world, attention is currency. And if you want power, influence, or wealth, you are told one thing: be loud. It's not about depth. It's not about clarity. It's about who can capture the spotlight. We reward the visible. We elevate those who speak with confidence, even if their words are hollow. We promote charisma over substance. And society claps the loudest for those who perform certainty, even if they are wrong. Carl Jung warned us of this long before social media, before branding, before the attention economy. He saw what happens when the persona, the social mask, is mistaken for the self. People begin to believe that the image is the identity, that the performance is the person, and eventually the mask becomes more important than the soul behind it. This is where introverts get left behind. Not because they lack insight, but because they refuse to compete in a game that was never built for depth. The game of attention, of constant self-promotion, of selling your story before you've had time to understand it. In business, the extrovert wins by being seen. In politics, they win by speaking louder. In media, they win by stirring emotion, not by offering perspective. And in all of it, the introvert falls into the background, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know how much of it is noise. They know that real ideas need silence to grow. That clarity doesn't come from shouting. That transformation often begins with listening, not speaking. But society doesn't pay for that. It pays for attention. And the marketplace rewards those who keep the machine loud, fast, and emotionally charged. The introvert? They are told to speak up, to be more approachable, to package their ideas into sound bites that entertain, not challenge. And if they don't, they are labeled difficult, or passive, or too intense, and they are passed over for someone more socially polished, more agreeable, more familiar. But here's what no one tells you. When introverts try to play that game, they lose something far more valuable than a promotion or a platform. They lose their center. Because to gain attention, they often have to betray their pace, their process, their integrity. And the moment they do that, they start to vanish, not from the world's view, but from themselves. That is the hidden cost. And it's one too high for many to pay. So they retreat. Not out of weakness, but to preserve what matters. They protect their energy, not because they are selfish, but because they understand how precious it is. They would rather be unseen than be fake. Rather be underestimated than be hollow. Rather be alone than be surrounded by noise. And that choice, the choice to stay true instead of stay relevant, is one that few are willing to make. Because in a world built on visibility, choosing invisibility is rebellion. So let me ask you this. If power today is built on performance, what kind of power are you willing to reject in order to stay real? Introverts don't start out wearing masks. They learn to wear them. From the first time someone says you're too quiet, from the awkward pauses when you don't fill the silence, from the teachers who praised participation over reflection, from the friends who drifted away because you weren't always available. The message comes early and often. If you want to belong, you have to perform. So you learn the script. You learn to smile even when you're tired. You laugh when something isn't funny. You nod when your mind is elsewhere. You say, "I'm good," when your energy is completely gone. You become what people need you to be in order to stay connected. Not because you're fake, but because you're trying to survive in a system that doesn't know how to hold quiet people. Carl Jung understood this conflict well. He believed that each person is born with a true self, but the world pressures us to trade that self for a persona, a mask that is more socially acceptable, more likable, more convenient. For introverts, this often means creating a version of yourself that is always available, always agreeable, always present. But that version is not who you are, it's who the world wants you to be. And after a while, the performance gets heavy. You feel it in your body, in the tension you carry in your chest, in the way you dread phone calls, in how you avoid crowded spaces, in the way you replay every conversation, wondering if you said too little or too much. Because no matter how well you perform, a part of you knows the truth. You were not built for constant exposure. You were not designed to always be on. You were not meant to dilute yourself just to be accepted. But society doesn't reward boundaries. It rewards availability. It doesn't honor emotional clarity. It honors speed and charm. It doesn't ask how you're really doing. It asks how fast you can respond. So when an introvert chooses not to perform, when they set a boundary, when they choose silence over small talk, or solitude over obligation, society pushes back. You'll be called distant, too intense, hard to approach, and all because you chose to protect the parts of yourself the world does not understand. But here's the truth. You don't owe your energy to every demand. You don't need to explain your quiet. You don't need to justify your need for space. Your worth is not tied to your visibility. Your value is not measured by how many people approve of you. You were not made to please crowds. You were made to understand the world from a place of depth. So ask yourself, what would it look like to stop performing? To speak only when you mean it. To show up only when you feel aligned. To exist without needing to explain your existence. You may lose people. You may make others uncomfortable. But what you'll gain is far more important. You'll begin to recognize yourself again. And for someone who has spent their life performing, that is a powerful beginning. It's easy to feel small when the world keeps asking you to be louder. When your quiet is treated like a flaw. When your stillness is seen as a problem that needs fixing. But what if the very thing you've been told to suppress is actually your greatest strength? Carl Jung believed that introverts hold a kind of energy that is not always visible, but deeply powerful. It is the energy of depth over speed, intention over reaction, truth over noise. In a culture obsessed with being seen, introverts do something radical. They look inward, they question instead of performing, they reflect instead of reacting. And in that silence, something begins to grow. Insight, intuition, clarity. You might not take up much space in a room, but you see everything. You feel what others miss. You notice the tension behind the words, the shift in someone's tone, the meaning in the pause. That is not weakness. That is presence. You don't speak often, but when you do, it matters. Your words are measured, not because you're afraid, but because you respect their weight. In a world drowning in information, introverts are the ones who listen. And listening, real, focused, silent listening, is becoming a lost art. Jung called this the process of individuation. It is the journey of becoming who you truly are beneath the mask, beneath the performance, beneath the noise. And this journey is not loud, it is quiet. It happens when no one is watching. It happens in solitude, in thought, in those long walks when the world fades and you finally hear your own voice. This is where introverts shine. Not under pressure, but in peace. Not in the spotlight, but in the spaces between. Not in competition, but in creation. But this kind of strength is slow. And because it doesn't shout, people often miss it. They don't see the weight you carry because you carry it without complaint. They don't hear the storm in your mind because you've learned how to stay calm on the surface. They don't know what it costs you to stay present in a world that constantly drains you. But you know, and that knowledge is enough. You don't need to prove your power. You don't need to win the crowd. You don't need to match the volume of a world that doesn't know how to be still. Because your quiet is not empty. It's full of meaning, full of memory, full of the kind of power that doesn't need applause to be real. So the next time someone says, "You're too quiet," smile. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they know who you are. Because while they chase attention, you are building something they will never understand. And one day, they'll wonder how you did it. Not with noise, but with clarity. There comes a moment in the life of every introvert when you stop apologizing for who you are. You stop saying sorry for needing space. You stop forcing smiles when you are exhausted. You stop pretending to be okay just to make others comfortable. You start choosing silence, not as retreat, but as power. Because silence, when chosen from awareness, is not emptiness. It is presence. It is resistance. It is strength. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed that real transformation happens when we stop living through the persona, the mask we wear to survive, and start listening to the self. The self does not scream. It does not beg for attention. It speaks quietly from beneath the noise. And when you begin to hear it, something shifts. You no longer need to perform. You no longer need to impress. You no longer seek approval from people who never truly saw you. Instead, you start to protect your energy like something sacred. You become more selective with your time, your presence, your words. You show up where you are valued, not where you are used. And yes, this change will confuse people. They will say you're distant now. They'll wonder why you're not as available as before. They'll tell you that you've changed, but you have not changed. You've returned to yourself, to your rhythm, to the truth you buried beneath years of trying to fit in. Choosing silence means not engaging every comment, not explaining every decision, not opening yourself to every invitation. It means letting people feel your absence, especially the ones who only noticed you when they needed something. And in that silence, something beautiful happens. The right people begin to hear you more clearly. The ones who listen between the lines. The ones who don't need performance to feel connection. The ones who recognize strength not in volume, but in consistency. They won't try to change you. They won't ask you to become louder, faster, more social. They will value your calm. They will respect your boundaries. They will protect your silence instead of invading it. And most importantly, you will start to respect it too. Because your silence is not a lack. It is a language. It says, "I am not here to entertain you." It says, "I am protecting something inside me that the world never learned to hold." It says, "I choose peace over attention." And in a society that cannot stop talking, that choice becomes revolutionary. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or misunderstood, not because you had nothing to say, but because you didn't want to shout over the noise, know this: you are not the problem. You are not broken. You are not too quiet. You are simply someone who listens to life in a deeper way. And that kind of listening, that kind of presence, that is what the world needs more of, not less. So let them talk. Let them misunderstand. Let them chase their noise. You have nothing to prove, because your silence is not a weakness. It is your voice at full volume.
The things that are interesting to them or are vital to them are utterly strange to the other individual.